I opened the front door with one hand still curled around the small white box I'd picked up on the way home. 5 years of marriage, vanilla frosting, a gold ribbon that said, "Happy Anniversary" in looping script. The living room lights were on, brighter than usual, and for a split second I wondered if he'd planned a surprise after all. Then I saw them. My husband was sitting on our couch, not even trying to stand. His jacket was draped over the armrest like he'd just arrived home from work. The woman beside him was too close to be mistaken for anything else. Her knee touched his. Her hand rested casually on his thigh, like it belonged there. This wasn't hurried. This wasn't sloppy. It was comfortable. The box slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. The sound was soft, almost embarrassing, like a mistake you hope no one notices. He looked at me slowly. No scramble, no panic, no guilt rising to his face. He didn't jump up or push her away. He didn't say my name. He sighed as if I'd interrupted something inconvenient and said, "Don't make a big deal out of this." That was it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't ask who she was or how long it had been going on. I just stood there, staring at the man I had spent 5 years defending, excusing, believing. In that moment, something cold settled in my chest, heavier than shock. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was practiced. I understood before either of them spoke again that whatever happened next would cost him far more than he expected. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Our wedding photo still hung on the wall behind them, perfectly straight, as if it had been watching the whole thing. The woman finally shifted, eyes dropping to the floor. She didn't apologize. She didn't look ashamed. She looked like someone waiting for instructions. My husband crossed his arms, relaxed, almost bored. "You're overreacting," he said before I'd said a word. "This isn't what you think." I studied his face instead of responding. The familiarity of it unsettled me more than the betrayal itself. I knew every line around his mouth, every expression he used when he wanted a conversation to end. This was the face he wore when he believed he was in control. "What do you want me to do?" he added, irritation slipping into his voice. "Make a scene?" There it was, the trap. If I raised my voice, I would become hysterical. If I cried, I would become weak. If I begged, I would confirm exactly what he thought of me. So I did none of those things. I bent down, picked up the crushed box from the floor and set it carefully on the coffee table. Frosting had smeared through the cardboard. The ribbon was broken. The woman glanced at it, then quickly away. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. He frowned, not because of guilt, but because I wasn't playing my part. "That's not important," he said. "You're focusing on the wrong thing." I nodded slowly, as if I agreed, though I didn't. What I was focusing on was his certainty. The way he spoke as if this conversation would end exactly how he wanted it to. As if I would either forgive him or fall apart, and either outcome would be manageable. "You can stay here tonight," he continued, gesturing vaguely around the room. "We'll talk later when you've calmed down." Calmed down, I almost laughed. Instead, I picked up my purse from the chair by the door. I hadn't planned on leaving, not when I walked in with that box in my hand, but the decision settled over me with strange clarity. Staying would mean explaining myself. Leaving meant I didn't owe anyone anything. He watched me closely now, something alert flickering in his eyes. "Where do you think you're going?" I met his gaze for the first time since I walked in. "Out," I said. "That's not necessary," he replied, sharper now. "You're being dramatic." I stepped past him without another word. He didn't reach for me. He didn't block the door. That told me more than any confession could have. He believed I'd be back by morning, shaken and uncertain, ready to pretend this night had been a misunderstanding. Outside, the air was cool against my face. The house behind me looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Neighbors' lights glowed softly down the street. Everything was ordinary. But something fundamental had shifted. As I walked to my car, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The man who had just told me not to make a big deal out of his betrayal had no idea what silence could do. And for the first time since I married him, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I drove for nearly an hour without a destination, the city blurring past my windshield, as if it didn't want to witness what had just happened. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my body felt hollow, like something essential had been quietly removed. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I needed the silence to understand whether I was numb or finally clear. I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town, the kind meant for people passing through, not staying. The woman at the front desk smiled politely, asked how my evening was going, and handed me a key card without recognizing that my life had just split in two. I thanked her, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. In the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. There were already 3 messages from him. The first was short and irritated. The second was longer, explaining how complicated things were. The third told me I was being unreasonable, and that we would talk in the morning. He signed it with my name, like a reminder of who I was supposed to be. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand. Lying there in the dim light, I replayed the scene in the living room over and over. Not the image of them together, but his expression, the absence of fear, the confidence that whatever damage he'd caused could be managed. That certainty hurt more than the affair itself. It told me this wasn't a lapse in judgment, it was a calculation. I realized then that I had been living inside a version of our marriage he had carefully curated. There had been signs I'd dismissed as stress or work pressure. Late nights explained away, calls taken in another room, moments when his attention drifted just slightly out of reach. I had filled in the gaps with trust because it was easier than questioning the foundation I stood on. By morning, the shock had worn off, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. I showered, dressed, and sat at the small desk by the window with a cup of burnt hotel coffee. The city outside was waking up, people heading to work, lives continuing as if nothing had happened. I opened my phone again. 12 missed calls, more messages. The tone had shifted from annoyance to concern, then back to irritation. He needed a response. Not because he cared how I felt, but because my silence disrupted his balance. I typed one sentence and deleted it, then another, then I put the phone down again. Instead, I opened my email and searched for old messages, old documents, anything that reminded me of how intertwined our lives had become. Accounts we'd opened together, decisions we'd made with his guidance, papers I'd signed without fully reading because I trusted him. Each discovery tightened the knot in my stomach, but it also sharpened my focus. I wasn't just hurt, I was exposed. I thought about the way he'd said, "Don't make a big deal out of this," as if the scale of betrayal were something he alone could define, as if my reaction were the problem, not his actions. That sentence echoed louder the longer I sat with it, and it clarified something essential. This wasn't just about another woman, it was about control. I checked out before noon and drove to a cafe across town, somewhere I knew he'd never think to look for me. I sat by the window with a notebook I'd bought on impulse at the hotel gift shop. The first page stayed blank for a long time. I didn't know how to begin writing the dismantling of a life. When I finally put pen to paper, I didn't write about pain or anger. I wrote facts, dates, patterns, questions that needed answers. I wrote down everything I remembered that had felt off over the last year and circled the ones that now made sense. It wasn't a plan yet. It was a map. My phone buzzed again, a voicemail this time. I listened without holding it to my ear, the sound tinny and distant on the table between my hands. His voice was calmer now, rehearsed. He said he was worried. He said we needed to be adults about this. He said we owed it to each other to talk. We owed each other. I deleted the message and felt something inside me lock into place. That afternoon, I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, someone I trusted but who existed outside our shared social circle. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. I just asked if I could stay with her for a few days. She said yes without hesitation, and the relief that washed over me was unexpected and sharp. As I drove toward her house, I understood that the hardest part was already behind me. Not discovering the affair, but accepting that the man I'd married believed I would absorb the damage quietly. that I would prioritize keeping the peace over preserving myself. He was wrong. By the time I pulled into her driveway, I wasn't thinking about confrontation or forgiveness. I was thinking about leverage, about information, about time. And I knew, with a steadiness that surprised me, that whatever came next would not be loud or impulsive. It would be deliberate. The first time I returned to the house, it was in the middle of a weekday afternoon, when I knew he would be at work and the neighborhood would be quiet. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, keys clenched in my fist, heart steady in a way that felt almost unnatural. I wasn't there to confront him, I was there to see clearly. Inside, the house smelled the same, clean, familiar, deceptively safe. The couch where I'd found them still looked untouched, the cushions fluffed, the throw blanket folded neatly over the arm. Evidence erased, as if the night before had been a dream I'd invented to justify leaving. That was his talent. He made chaos disappear so convincingly that you questioned whether it had ever existed. I moved slowly, opening drawers, cabinets, the hall closet. Not searching frantically, not yet. I was taking inventory. What belonged to me? What belonged to us? What belonged to him alone? Each object told a story I'd ignored when the narrative was easier to believe. In the office, his laptop sat closed on the desk, a leather folder stacked neatly beside it. I didn't open either. I didn't need to. I knew now that whatever I wanted to find wouldn't be handed to me in obvious ways. It would live in margins and habits and places no one thought to question. I went upstairs and opened the bedroom closet. My clothes still hung on the left, his on the right. Shoes lined up in pairs, his ties organized by color. I pressed my palm against the wall and breathed. This room had witnessed every promise we'd made. It had also held every secret he'd carried home and locked away behind a smile. I packed a small suitcase, not everything, just enough to make my absence undeniable. As I zipped it closed, my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen, bold and insistent. I let it ring. When it stopped, a message appeared. "We need to talk today. This can't wait." I stared at the words and felt nothing. No spike of fear, no urge to explain. The power he'd always wielded lived in urgency, in forcing conversations before I'd had time to think. I wasn't stepping back into that rhythm. Downstairs, I paused by the coffee table and noticed something I'd missed before. The anniversary cake box was gone. The space it had occupied was clean, empty, as if it had never been there. The erasure felt intentional, a small thing but revealing. He wasn't just minimizing what he'd done. He was rewriting it. I left the house and didn't lock the door behind me. That evening, at my friend's kitchen table, I spread out the notes I'd been making. Dates, conversations, moments that had felt wrong in hindsight. She listened quietly, asking questions I hadn't considered, not pushing, not dramatizing. When I told her about the way he'd spoken to me, the calm dismissal, her jaw tightened. "He assumed you wouldn't leave," she said. I nodded. "He still does." Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, I opened my email again. This time I searched more deliberately. Old threads, attachments I'd never opened, messages forwarded between accounts I didn't recognize at first glance. The deeper I went, the more I understood how carefully he'd segmented his life. How much effort it took to keep me believing I was at the center of it. There were gaps I couldn't explain yet, and I didn't force them to make sense. I flagged what mattered, and let the rest sit. This wasn't about catching him in a lie he'd already admitted to. It was about understanding the system he'd built around himself and how I'd been folded into it without consent. Another message came through just after midnight. "I'm worried about you. Please come home. Let's not involve anyone else." I read it twice, then smiled despite myself. There it was. The fear, finally peeking through the concern. Not fear of losing me, but fear of exposure. Fear of losing control over who knew what and when. I didn't reply. The next morning, I made a call I'd been putting off. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't recount the night in the living room or describe the woman on the couch. I asked careful questions instead, neutral ones. About documents, accounts, options I didn't realize existed. The answers didn't shock me, they grounded me. After I hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting in my lap, breathing evenly. The path ahead wasn't clear yet, but I could see the shape of it. This wasn't going to be resolved with a single conversation or an emotional reckoning. It would unfold in steps, each one deliberate, each one stripping away another layer of his certainty. That afternoon, I finally sent him a message. "I need space. I'll reach out when I'm ready to talk." The response came almost instantly. "This isn't fair." I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the table. Fairness, I realized, was a word he used when the rules no longer favored him. By the end of the day, I understood something fundamental. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. And the longer I held it, the more clearly he revealed himself, reaching, grasping, making mistakes he didn't know were mistakes yet. Whatever he thought he knew about me, about us, about how this would end, was already outdated. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. By the end of the week, the silence had done what confrontation never could. It made him restless. His messages shifted in tone without warning. 1 hour he was calm and reasonable. The next he was sharp, accusing me of punishing him. He alternated between concern and entitlement, as if cycling through emotions might unlock the response he wanted. I watched it happen from a distance, phone face down on the counter, my attention fixed on what the pattern revealed rather than what the words said. Control, I realized, had always been his language. When I finally agreed to meet, I chose the place and the time. A quiet cafe near his office, late afternoon, public enough to discourage theatrics. I arrived early and sat where I could see the door. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. He walked in with the confidence of someone who believed this meeting existed for his benefit. His suit was pressed, his hair neat, his expression carefully neutral. He smiled when he saw me, a familiar curve of the mouth that once meant reassurance. Now it looked rehearsed. "I'm glad you came," he said, sitting down without waiting to be invited. "I've been worried." I nodded, non-committal, and took a sip of my coffee. He launched into explanations before I could speak. Not apologies. Explanations. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how complicated things had become. He framed the affair as something that had happened to him, not something he had chosen. When I didn't interrupt, he leaned forward, encouraged. "You know this doesn't change what we have," he said softly. 5 years doesn't disappear because of one mistake." I studied him as he spoke, the way his hands moved, the rhythm of his voice. He was still trying to guide the conversation, to pull it back into familiar territory where he led and I followed. "Why did you tell me not to make a big deal out of it?" I asked. The question caught him off guard. He blinked, then frowned slightly. "Because I didn't want you to blow it out of proportion." "Out of proportion to what?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "That night," I continued, my voice steady, "you weren't afraid. You weren't sorry. You were irritated. That's what I can't stop thinking about." His jaw tightened. "You're reading too much into it." "No," I said, "I'm reading exactly what was there." For the first time since he sat down, his confidence slipped. Not dramatically, just a fraction. He glanced around the cafe, then back at me, lowering his voice. "You're acting like I betrayed you." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "I came to understand something." "And have you?" he asked, defensiveness creeping in. "Yes," I replied. "I understand that you expected me to absorb this quietly, that you assumed my role was to preserve your comfort, not my dignity." His eyes hardened. "You're being unfair." "There it is again," I said calmly. "Fair." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What do you want from me?" The question wasn't an offer. It was a test. If I asked for reassurance, he could give it. If I asked for honesty, he could ration it. If I asked for forgiveness, he could withhold it. He was prepared for every option except the one I chose. "I want time," I said. "For what?" "To decide what I do next." His expression shifted, irritation flashing across his face. "You don't get to drag this out. We need to fix this." I met his gaze evenly. You need to fix it. The difference landed between us like a dropped glass. That's not how marriage works, he snapped. No, I said, that's how control works. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. A few heads turned. He seemed to realize where he was and forced himself to sit back down, breath tight. You're making a mistake, he said through clenched teeth. You think you have leverage. You don't. I noted the word he chose, leverage, not love, not remorse. I didn't say anything about leverage, I replied. He stared at me, suspicion creeping into his eyes. Then what are you doing? I'm paying attention, I said. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. He broke it first, voice lower now, controlled. Let's be clear, whatever you think you're planning, it won't end the way you imagine. I stood and gathered my coat. We'll see. As I walked out, I felt his gaze on my back, sharp and searching. He had expected tears, anger, bargaining. What he got instead was restraint. And restraint, I was learning, frightened him far more than rage ever could. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Don't do anything you'll regret. I slipped the phone into my pocket without replying. That meeting confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control over the narrative, over the timing, over the consequences. And now that fear was close to the surface, driving him to test boundaries he assumed still belonged to him. He had made his first mistake by underestimating my silence. He was about to make many more. The next few days unfolded quietly on the surface, but underneath, everything was shifting. I stopped responding altogether. No messages, no acknowledgments, no explanations. I didn't block him, didn't mute him, didn't dramatize my absence in any visible way. I simply removed myself from the rhythm he was used to controlling. The effect was immediate. His messages multiplied. At first they were polite, almost professional, checking in, asking how I was feeling, reminding me of shared responsibilities, shared history. Then the tone sharpened. He accused me of being immature, of refusing to communicate like an adult. When that didn't work, the messages softened again, laced with nostalgia, memories carefully selected to pull at something familiar. I read none of them right away. I let them accumulate. Instead, I focused on patterns, the timing of his calls, the escalation after periods of silence, the moments he chose to bring up practical matters, as if logistics could anchor me back into place. He was improvising now, and improvisation exposed habits he'd never needed to examine before. One afternoon, my friend handed me her tablet and said, "You should see this." It was a post from someone I barely recognized at first. A mutual acquaintance, vague, carefully worded, but unmistakable once you knew where to look. A comment about betrayal, about discovering truths you weren't meant to see. No names, no accusations, just enough to spark curiosity. I felt a brief flicker of surprise, followed by something colder. I hadn't told anyone beyond a very small circle, which meant the story was moving without me. That night I checked my phone. His messages had changed again. "Why are people asking me questions? Who did you talk to? This is getting out of hand." I stared at the screen, then set the phone down without responding. For the first time, I understood the power of letting other people connect the dots themselves. I hadn't accused him. I hadn't exposed anything directly. And yet, his carefully maintained image was beginning to crack. The next morning, he called repeatedly. I let it ring until it stopped, then continued with my day. I went grocery shopping. I ran errands. I did mundane things deliberately, grounding myself in the normalcy he was losing. When I finally checked my voicemail that evening, his voice sounded different. Not angry. Afraid. "You need to stop this," he said. "This isn't fair. You're letting people believe things that aren't true." I almost admired the logic. If I wasn't speaking, I was still responsible. If others noticed inconsistencies, it was my fault for not correcting them. The narrative, in his mind, still belonged to him. I deleted the message. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. He showed up at places he thought I might be. He contacted friends I hadn't spoken to in years. He reached out to my family under the guise of concern. Each attempt was another confirmation that he was losing his grip on the situation. What he didn't realize was that every move he made left traces. I began documenting everything: dates, times, screenshots, not out of paranoia, but precision. When someone acts calmly, they can afford to be sloppy. When someone panics, they reveal more than they intend. One evening, as I sat alone in my borrowed bedroom, my phone buzzed with a message that made me pause. "We need to talk, in person, tonight." I read it once, then again. There was no attempt at politeness this time, no softening language, just expectation. The assumption that urgency still gave him authority. I replied with one sentence: "I'm not available." The response came instantly: "You're doing this on purpose." Yes, I thought, finally. He followed up with something he must have believed would stop me cold. "You're going to embarrass yourself if this keeps going." I stared at the words until they lost their shape. Embarrassment. That was the threat. Not heartbreak, not loss, reputation, image, the thing he'd always protected first. I set the phone down and let the silence stretch. By the end of the week, the atmosphere around him had changed. I could feel it through second-hand conversations, through the sudden hesitation in people's voices when his name came up. No one accused him openly, no one confronted him directly. But uncertainty had entered the room, and uncertainty was dangerous. For the first time since the night in the living room, I felt something close to calm. Not satisfaction, not revenge. Control. He had believed my silence meant confusion, weakness, indecision. What it actually meant was that I was no longer reacting to him. I was watching him react to the absence of the role I used to play. And every message he sent, every boundary he crossed, every attempt to rush or intimidate me was proof of the same thing. He needed me to speak. I didn't need to say a word. The first real crack appeared when he tried to threaten something he no longer controlled. It started with a message sent late at night, the kind meant to unsettle me before sleep. He wrote that he was considering making changes to our finances, that he needed to protect himself if I continued to be unreasonable. He mentioned accounts, responsibilities, obligations we supposedly shared. He assumed the words would land like a warning shot. Instead, they clarified everything. I read the message slowly, then again, paying attention not to what he said, but to what he revealed. He believed money was still his leverage. He believed access equaled authority. He believed I would panic at the idea of instability and rush back to negotiate. He was wrong on all three counts. The next morning I made a call I'd been preparing for since the cafe meeting. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't raise my voice or explain my emotions. I asked questions, careful ones, about rights, processes, safeguards I hadn't known existed because I'd never imagined needing them. When I hung up, my hands were calm. That afternoon I received another message from him, this one sharper than the last. "If you think you can lock me out, you're mistaken." I smiled just briefly, then put the phone down. He had assumed his threat was preventative. What it actually was evidence. Evidence of intent, evidence of panic. Evidence that he was already moving pieces without understanding the board had changed. I spent the rest of the day organizing information. Statements, records, documents I'd quietly gathered over the past weeks without drawing attention to myself. Each file told a story of shared trust slowly repurposed into control. Not illegal, not yet, but close enough to matter. That night he called again. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. "You're forcing my hand," he said, his voice tight. "You don't know what you're doing." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. The following day, the consequences arrived quietly. An account he referenced in his messages flagged activity for review. A routine process on the surface. A delay. A question. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but enough to interrupt momentum. He felt it immediately. His response was instant. "What did you do?" I didn't answer. He followed up with another message, then another. The language shifted again, slipping from authority into accusation. "This is low. You're trying to trap me. You can't do this without my consent." I read each one and saved them. Then I closed the app. By evening, the phone calls began. He didn't leave messages this time. He didn't need to. The volume alone told me everything. He was losing the ability to predict outcomes, and that terrified him. What surprised me most wasn't his anger. It was his disbelief. He genuinely couldn't understand how something had moved without his permission, as if systems only functioned when he directed them, as if I'd never been more than an extension of his will. I thought back to the living room, to the way he'd sighed when he saw me standing there, to how certain he'd been that night would resolve itself with minimal disruption. He had never imagined I would step outside the frame he built for me. That night, a message came through that stopped me cold. "We need to fix this before it gets worse. Not apologize, not explain. Fix." As if the problem were mechanical, as if consequences were malfunctions to be corrected, not results to be faced. I typed a response, then erased it. Instead, I turned off my phone and went to bed. The next morning, I woke to an email forwarded by a mutual contact. Short, polite, carefully worded. A question about something he'd promised that now seemed uncertain. A ripple, small but undeniable. The dam wasn't breaking yet, but it was leaking. By midday, he tried a different approach. His tone softened dramatically, the aggression replaced with concern so sudden it was almost theatrical. He asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping, if I was safe. The shift would have been laughable if it hadn't been so transparent. He needed me to engage. I didn't. That afternoon, I reviewed the messages one last time. The threats, the accusations, the sudden concern. Together they formed a clear arc. Control threatened, control challenged, control unraveling. For the first time, I felt certain I wasn't imagining his behavior or exaggerating its meaning. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a rough patch. This was a man accustomed to power discovering its limits. And he didn't like it. By the end of the day, I understood something essential. His biggest mistake wasn't cheating on me. It was assuming that my silence meant ignorance, that my calm meant compliance, that my absence meant weakness. In trying to scare me, he had exposed himself. And once that happened, there was no going back to the way things were. I didn't hear about the first rumor directly. It reached me the way these things always do, through hesitation. A friend paused mid-sentence when my name came up, then changed the subject. Another asked, too casually, if everything was okay between me and my husband. Their voices carried a new carefulness, the kind people use when they're trying not to step on something fragile. I thanked them, smiled, and said nothing more. Silence had become my most reliable ally. What surprised me wasn't that people noticed. It was how quickly uncertainty spread once it did. By the end of the week, the questions multiplied. Not accusations, questions. Had they seen me lately? Was I still living at the house? Had something happened? No one wanted details, but everyone wanted confirmation. The story didn't need to be told outright. It assembled itself in fragments, in whispers, in the gaps left by my absence. His response was immediate and clumsy. He began calling mutual friends, trying to get ahead of the narrative. He framed it as concern for me, for us, for privacy. He asked people not to speculate. Asked them to be respectful. Asked them to trust that everything was under control. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so revealing. Control, always that word, whether spoken or implied. The more he tried to contain the conversation, the more visible it became. People who had never questioned him before began to notice the strain beneath his composure. He was sharper, more defensive, quicker to explain himself. Confidence, when forced, has a way of betraying its own absence. I heard about the dinner first, a small gathering I hadn't attended, one where my name hovered uncomfortably over the table. Someone asked where I was. Someone else shrugged. He offered an answer that sounded reasonable enough, but it landed wrong. Too rehearsed, too smooth. That was when it started to turn. The woman, the one from the living room, became part of the story without anyone needing to say her name. Her presence had been quiet for so long that its sudden visibility raised questions all on its own. People noticed patterns, timing, coincidences that no longer felt coincidental. I didn't confirm anything. I didn't deny anything. I let the truth move at its own pace. My phone buzzed more frequently now, but not from him. Messages came from acquaintances checking in, from people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembering my number. Their concern felt genuine, But it also carried curiosity. I answered politely, vaguely. I didn't owe anyone clarity yet. He, on the other hand, was unraveling. His messages arrived in bursts, the gaps between them growing shorter. He asked what I was telling people. He accused me of encouraging gossip. He warned me that reputations were fragile things and that I was playing a dangerous game. I saved every message. One evening, he showed up at my friend's house unannounced. I wasn't there. When she told me later, her voice was tight with anger. He'd been polite, apologetic, worried. He said he just wanted to make sure I was safe, that he was afraid I was isolating myself. Isolation, another word he used when he felt excluded from control. The next morning I noticed the shift online. Subtle, but undeniable. Invitations he'd once received regularly went unanswered. Comments on his posts slowed, then stopped. Familiar names disappeared from threads where they'd once been eager to engage. Nothing dramatic enough to confront, but enough to feel. He felt it. That afternoon he called me for the first time in days. I let it go to voicemail. "We need to talk," he said, breathless now. "This is spiraling. People are making assumptions. If you have something to say, say it. Don't do this behind my back." Behind his back, as if the truth belonged to him. I didn't respond. The pressure escalated quickly after that. He began sending longer messages, outlining his version of events as if preparing a defense. He reminded me of everything we'd built together, everything we stood to lose. He warned me that public opinion was fickle, that once something was said, it couldn't be taken back. He was right about one thing. Once a narrative loses its single author, it becomes impossible to control. What he couldn't understand was that I wasn't trying to destroy him. I wasn't trying to humiliate him or extract revenge in the way he expected. I was allowing consequences to exist without interference. I was letting the world respond to what it observed, not what it was told. Late one night, as I sat alone scrolling through messages I hadn't answered, I felt a strange sense of distance settle over me. Not numbness, perspective. The story unfolding around him no longer felt like mine to manage. That realization was freeing. By the end of the week, the man who had once told me not to make a big deal out of his betrayal was watching his carefully constructed image fracture in real time. He couldn't plug the leaks, he couldn't silence the questions, and he couldn't force me back into the role of interpreter or defender. For the first time, the narrative wasn't reacting to his commands. It was moving on without him. And I understood then that the quiet phase was over. What came next wouldn't be subtle or deniable. The consequences he feared were no longer hypothetical. They were already in motion. He reached out first, just as I knew he would. The message arrived early in the morning, casual enough to pretend nothing had changed. He asked if I was sleeping well, if I'd eaten, if I wanted to grab coffee later and talk like adults. The phrasing was deliberate, designed to sound reasonable, almost generous. He still believed calmness was his greatest weapon. I read it once and set my phone down. An hour later, another message followed. This one less relaxed. He said people were asking questions, that things were getting uncomfortable, that it would help everyone if I clarified a few misunderstandings. The word everyone stood out. It was his favorite way to disguise his own anxiety. I waited until afternoon before responding. "I'm fine, I don't have anything to clarify." That was all. The shift was immediate. His reply came less than a minute later. "What do you mean you don't have anything to clarify? You know exactly what's going on. You can't just disappear and let people assume things." I stared at the screen, recognizing the familiar impatience beneath the words. He wasn't asking anymore. He was pushing. I typed slowly. "I haven't said anything to anyone." A pause, longer this time. Then, "Silence is saying something." There it was. The admission slipped out without him realizing it. He needed my voice to stabilize his world. Without it, everything tilted. "You're doing this to punish me," he added. I set the phone aside and went about my day, grocery shopping, laundry, ordinary tasks that grounded me while his messages piled up unanswered. When I checked again that evening, the tone had changed completely. "You're being unreasonable. This isn't fair. We need to handle this privately." Privately. as if the truth were something that could be contained once released. That night, he called. I watched the phone vibrate on the table until it stopped. A voicemail followed, his voice tight, controlled but strained. "You don't understand what you're risking," he said. "People talk. Things get distorted. You should care about how this looks." How this looks? Not how it happened, not why it happened, not what it cost. Just how it looked. The next morning, he made his first real mistake. He sent a message meant to scare me. He said that if I kept this up, he'd have no choice but to protect himself. That he'd talk to people before the story got away from him. That he could say things too. The implication was clear: mutually assured damage, a threat disguised as honesty. I read it twice, then once more, feeling something settle into place. This wasn't confidence, it was desperation. And desperation always overplays its hand. "You can say whatever you want," I wrote back. "I won't stop you." The response didn't come right away. When it did, the tone was sharper than anything he'd used before. "Don't be naive. You think this won't affect you?" There it was again. Control, reaching for intimidation when persuasion failed. I didn't answer. By the end of the day, his messages had grown erratic. Short bursts of anger followed by long, rambling explanations. He contradicted himself repeatedly, offering reassurance one moment and accusations the next. The composure he'd maintained for years was cracking, and it showed in every word. That evening I heard from someone else. A mutual acquaintance called, hesitant, apologetic. She said she'd run into him earlier that day, that he seemed distracted, edgy, that he'd said something strange about me refusing to communicate and how unfair that was. She asked gently if I was okay. I thanked her and said I was. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet room and let the reality sink in. He was talking now, not strategically, not carefully. He was reacting. And in doing so, he was revealing far more than I ever could. Later that night, another message arrived. This one longer, more calculated. "Let's meet. Just us. No more games. You owe me that." I stared at the word "owe." For years I had carried that weight without questioning it. Owed him patience. Owed him understanding. Owed him loyalty even when it came at my expense. Seeing the word now, stripped of sentiment, felt clarifying. "I don't owe you anything," I typed. "I'm taking time. Please stop contacting me." The typing bubble appeared, vanished, then appeared again. "You're making a mistake," he finally sent. "You think you're in control? You're not." I smiled faintly as I set the phone down. That was the moment he realized something had shifted beyond his reach. Not because I'd announced it, not because I'd confronted him, but because the tools he'd always relied on no longer worked. Calm words, implied threats, appeals to reason. None of them moved me anymore. He was still trying to manage the situation. I had already stepped outside of it. And as I turned off the light and let the room go dark, I understood what frightened him most. It wasn't exposure, it wasn't judgment. It was the realization that I was no longer asking what he wanted to happen next. I was letting him reveal himself, one message at a time. I didn't announce anything, I didn't post, hint, or explain. And still the story broke free from him. It started with a question that wasn't meant for me. Someone asked him casually whether everything was okay at home. He laughed it off, according to the person who later told me, said we were just taking space. But the laugh lingered too long, and the explanation arrived too quickly. That was the moment people began listening differently. The first ripple came from his workplace. Not an accusation, an inquiry. A polite email requesting clarification about a scheduling conflict that suddenly mattered more than it should have. Then another. Small procedural things that only become urgent when attention has shifted. He felt it immediately, the way a man feels the floor tilt before anyone else notices. He called me twice that afternoon. I didn't answer. By evening, his messages were no longer about me. They were about containment, about how things were being misinterpreted, about how unfair it was that people jumped to conclusions. He asked if I knew who had started talking. He asked if I would help him shut it down. Help him shut it down. I sat at the kitchen table, phone in front of me, and realized how much effort he had spent over the years ensuring that I would be the one to clean up after him. Smooth things over, translate his intentions, protect his image even when it cost me my own clarity. I didn't respond. The next day, the other woman became visible without trying to be. Someone spotted her with him at lunch, somewhere public enough to be noticed but not dramatic enough to feel staged. The sight would have meant nothing a month earlier. Now it became a confirmation, not of guilt but of pattern. People began connecting what they had seen with what they had sensed. The story didn't need embellishment. It only needed time. He panicked. That night, he sent a string of messages that read like a rehearsal gone wrong. He insisted she wasn't important, that it was over, that it had never meant anything. Then, in the next breath, he warned me not to let people think she was the reason for our problems. The contradiction was almost elegant. I saved every message. By the end of the week, the consequences began stacking quietly, efficiently. Meetings postponed, invitations rescinded, conversations that once flowed easily now ended abruptly. No one accused him outright. No one needed to. Doubt does more damage than outrage ever could. I heard about the meeting through someone else. A closed-door conversation with his superiors, framed as routine, but serious enough to leave him visibly shaken afterward. He told them we were separated. He told them it was mutual. He told them everything was under control. He told me none of this directly. Instead, he sent another message asking if we could talk for the sake of appearances. The phrase burned itself into my memory. Not for closure, not for honesty, appearances. I didn't answer. The shift became impossible to ignore after that. People stopped asking me careful questions and started offering quiet support instead. A hand on my arm, a look that said they understood more than they were saying. I didn't correct them. I didn't encourage them. I let the truth stand without commentary. Without. He tried one last time to reclaim the narrative. He sent a long message late one night, carefully worded, almost persuasive. He said he was taking responsibility, that he was committed to repairing his reputation, that he hoped I wouldn't interfere while he did so. He framed it as respect. I read it once, then closed my phone. What he didn't understand was that the narrative no longer belonged to either of us. It belonged to the people watching him scramble to explain away what had become obvious. It belonged to the silence he couldn't fill and the inconsistencies he couldn't hide. A few days later, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Professional, measured. They didn't accuse, they didn't probe. They simply asked if I would be open to answering a few questions in the future, should the need arise. I thanked them and said yes. When I hung up, I felt something settle that I hadn't felt since the night in the living room. Not vindication, not relief, finality. He had spent years building a version of himself that relied on my cooperation, on my discretion, on my willingness to absorb discomfort quietly. The moment I stopped doing that, the structure began to collapse under its own weight. That evening, he sent one last message. This has gone too far. I looked at the words for a long time before replying. No, I thought, this is exactly as far as it needed to go. I didn't send the thought. I didn't send anything at all. By then, the scandal was no longer something he could contain or negotiate. It had entered systems bigger than his influence, spaces where silence spoke louder than spin. He was no longer reacting to me. He was reacting to consequences. And for the first time since our anniversary, I slept without waking in the middle of the night, my mind finally quiet enough to rest. The noise eventually turned into paperwork. That was the moment everything changed. Scandal, I learned, is loud at first. People whisper, speculate, avoid eye contact. But when institutions get involved, the volume drops. Conversations move behind closed doors. Words become records. Intent becomes traceable. I felt it the morning I sat across from a lawyer who didn't ask how I was feeling. She asked what I wanted protected. The question landed differently than I expected. For weeks, everything had been framed as reaction, how I should respond, what I should tolerate when I should speak. This was the first time someone treated my future as the priority rather than the aftermath of his behavior. "I want stability," I said after a moment, "and I want everything documented." She nodded, already flipping through notes. Then we moved quietly. That afternoon, I learned how fragile confidence becomes when it's built on assumptions instead of safeguards. Accounts I'd barely thought about, decisions I'd signed off on without question, structures designed for trust that now required scrutiny. Nothing illegal on the surface, nothing dramatic, but enough to create leverage he didn't know existed. Enough to slow him down. The first formal notice went out without warning. A request for review, routine language, neutral tone, no accusations, just questions that required answers in writing. It wasn't a threat, it was a pause. He felt it immediately. My phone buzzed less than an hour later. "What's going on? Why are there delays? Did you do this?" I didn't reply. By the next day, his messages shifted from indignation to urgency. He said this was unnecessary, that we could resolve things privately, that involving lawyers would only make things worse for both of us. He framed it as concern, but the edges were sharp. He needed speed. He needed reassurance. He needed me to stop what was already in motion. I let the systems do their work. The most revealing moment came when he tried to act confident through it. He sent a message claiming he'd already spoken to his attorney, that everything was fine, that I was overestimating my position. But confidence doesn't announce itself. Later that evening, I received copies of communications he hadn't realized I'd see. Requests for extensions, clarifications, a sudden eagerness to cooperate that hadn't existed days earlier. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like compliance that arrives too fast. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Over the next few days, the shift became structural. He could no longer make unilateral decisions. Actions that once moved automatically now required oversight. Conversations that used to happen casually now carried formal weight. He wasn't frozen out entirely, but the freedom he'd taken for granted was gone. He noticed. "You're trying to trap me," he said during one of his calls, voice low and tight. "You're turning this into something it doesn't have to be." I listened without interrupting, letting him fill the silence himself. "This doesn't make you look good either," he added quickly. "People will think you're vindictive." Vindictive. The word felt almost quaint. "I'm not thinking about how this looks," I said calmly. "I'm thinking about how it functions." He went quiet. That was when he understood he wasn't arguing with emotion anymore. He was negotiating with process, and process doesn't bend to tone or familiarity. By the end of the week, everything he once handled informally had a trail attached to it. Emails replaced conversations. Meetings replaced assumptions. His name began appearing in contexts he couldn't charm his way out of. He tried one last angle. He sent a message late one night, carefully phrased, almost conciliatory. He said he wanted to de-escalate, that we could pause legal involvement if I agreed to meet, that we could still control the damage if we worked together. Together. I stared at the word until it lost meaning. I didn't reply. The following morning, I met with my lawyer again. We reviewed what had changed, what was pending, what could no longer be undone. She didn't smile, she didn't dramatize, she simply confirmed what I already knew. "He doesn't have the upper hand anymore," she said, "and he knows it." That afternoon, his silence replaced the messages. No threats, no reassurances, no accusations, just absence, the kind that follows realization. For the first time since the anniversary, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Not triumph, not satisfaction, security. He had always believed power came from speed and confidence, from saying things first and saying them loudly. What he hadn't accounted for was the quiet strength of systems that don't care who you think you are. That evening, as I closed my laptop and turned off the light, I understood something clearly. This was no longer a battle of narratives or emotions. It was infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't forget. Whatever he tried next wouldn't be resolved with words or apologies. The ground beneath him had shifted permanently, and no amount of reassurance could restore what he'd lost. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were official. When the noise faded, what remained was smaller than I expected. Not emptier, smaller. The calls stopped first, not abruptly, but gradually, like someone testing a room for echoes and finding none. His name appeared less often on my phone, then not at all. The silence this time wasn't strategic. It was resignation. I noticed the change through other people before I felt it myself. Friends who had once defended him avoided mentioning his name. Family members who had urged patience now spoke carefully, as if choosing neutrality was safer than loyalty. No one said he was wrong outright. They didn't need to. Their distance did the work for them. He had built his world on access, invitations, favors, the unspoken assurance that being close to him meant something. When those doors began to close, one by one, the effect was cumulative. Power doesn't vanish in a single moment. It erodes. I heard about the missed dinner first. Then the meeting he wasn't invited to. Then the position he assumed was secure suddenly becoming under review. None of it dramatic enough to confront. All of it impossible to ignore. He tried to rewrite the story. Through mutual contacts, he framed himself as overwhelmed, misunderstood. He spoke of stress, of miscommunication, of a marriage that had grown distant without either of us noticing. He never denied the affair outright. He simply minimized it, folding it into a larger narrative where no one was truly at fault. I didn't correct him. Lies need witnesses to survive. The truth doesn't require maintenance. The moment that stayed with me came late one evening, when he finally reached out directly after weeks of silence. Not with anger, not with threats, with something closer to honesty than I'd heard in years. "I don't recognize my life anymore," he said when I answered. His voice was quieter than I remembered. "Everything feels unstable." I listened without interrupting. He talked about the pressure, about how quickly things had unraveled, about people he'd expected to stand by him pulling away without explanation. He spoke as if these losses were sudden, unfair, inexplicable. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. The question lingered in the space between us. Once I would have filled it, explained myself, reassured him, tried to smooth the edges of his discomfort. "I don't want anything," I said. The silence that followed was different. Not tense, not confrontational, just empty. "You don't care what happens to me?" he asked. I thought about the woman on the couch, about the calm dismissal, about the assumption that I would absorb the damage quietly so his life could continue uninterrupted. "I care," I said carefully, "but I'm not responsible for fixing what you broke." He exhaled slowly as if the air had been knocked out of him. "So that's it?" "Yes," I said. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time, surprised by the absence of triumph. There was no satisfaction in watching him struggle to find footing in a world that no longer bent around him. What I felt instead was distance, clean and unmistakable. In the weeks that followed, his world continued to shrink. Not dramatically, just steadily. People who once sought his approval no longer needed it. Systems that once deferred to his confidence now required proof. The identity he'd worn so comfortably, competent, untouchable in control, had lost its audience. I realized then that he hadn't lost a marriage. He had lost certainty. Certainty that he would be believed, certainty that silence would protect him, certainty that consequences were negotiable. I, on the other hand, had gained something quieter and far more durable. Clarity. I no longer wondered whether I'd imagined his behavior or exaggerated its meaning. I no longer questioned whether I'd been too harsh or too slow or too calm. The shape of the truth had revealed itself without my intervention. One afternoon, as I sorted through old documents I no longer needed, I came across a photograph from our early years. We looked happy, or perhaps just hopeful. I studied it for a moment, then set it aside without ceremony. The past didn't need to be destroyed to lose its power. By the time winter arrived, his name felt distant, like a reference from another life. Not painful, not tender, just irrelevant. Justice, I realized, doesn't always arrive with applause or acknowledgement. Sometimes it comes as alignment. when actions finally meet consequences, and you're no longer asked to stand in the middle holding them apart. As I closed the door on that chapter, I understood something essential. I hadn't won against him. I had stepped away from a story that was never meant to define me. And in doing so, I left him alone with the only person who could truly answer for what he'd done. The first morning I woke up without thinking about him, I didn't recognize the feeling right away. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't relief, it was quiet. Sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor of my new place, catching dust in the air like something suspended and harmless. I lay there for a moment, listening to the city outside, cars passing, someone laughing, a dog barking in the distance, and realized my body was no longer braced for impact. There was no message to anticipate, no tone to decode, no tension waiting just beneath the surface. Peace, I learned, doesn't announce itself, it settles. I made coffee and drank it slowly by the window, watching people hurry toward lives that were not mine. This space was small, intentionally so. Every object in it had been chosen by me, for me. There were no compromises hidden in drawers, no memories staged to preserve an image. Just air, light, and the simple relief of knowing I belonged here. For a long time I had defined myself by endurance, by how much I could absorb without breaking. I thought that was strength. I thought loyalty meant staying silent when something hurt, smoothing over discomfort so others could remain comfortable. I see now how wrong I was. The betrayal didn't destroy me. The realization did. The understanding that I had been asked, quietly, repeatedly, to make myself smaller so someone else could feel larger. That I had mistaken restraint for love and patience for safety. Standing in that living room on our 5th anniversary had cracked something open. Not my heart, my clarity. I think about that moment sometimes, but it no longer tightens my chest. I remember the calm on his face, the way he told me not to make a big deal out of it. And I understand now that it wasn't confidence, it was entitlement. He believed my silence was guaranteed. He was wrong. What followed wasn't revenge, not in the way people imagine it. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public speeches, no victory laps. There was only alignment, truth meeting consequence without my interference. Systems doing what they were designed to do once the truth was no longer protected by my cooperation. I didn't take anything from him. I stopped protecting him from himself. In the months since, I've rebuilt my life in ways that don't look impressive from the outside. I sleep better. I laugh more easily. I listen to my instincts instead of overriding them for the sake of peace. I no longer rehearse conversations in my head or apologize for emotions I'm entitled to feel. The most surprising change has been trust, not in others, in myself. I trust the woman who walked out that night with nothing but her purse and her dignity. I trust the woman who chose silence over spectacle, patience over panic. I trust the woman who learned that boundaries don't need to be loud to be immovable. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not weak for staying as long as you did. You are not foolish for believing someone you loved. And you are not broken for needing time to see the truth when it finally appears. Leaving doesn't always look like slamming a door. Sometimes it looks like stepping back and refusing to explain yourself anymore. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people see who someone is without trying to soften the image. My story didn't end with him apologizing or understanding what he lost. It ended with me understanding what I deserved. A life where calm doesn't come at the cost of self-respect. A future that doesn't require me to disappear for it to work. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Whether you've lived something similar, or you're standing at the edge of a decision you haven't made yet, you're not alone here. Share what stood out to you in the comments. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step toward clarity. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, truth, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself, I hope you'll stay with this channel. Subscribe, take a breath, and come back when you're ready. You're welcome here. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.